Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Tuesday night Bible study on the book of Daniel that we've been going through on Tuesday nights. This week, we're in Daniel chapter 7. I'm trying to get a couple of things set up. I'm on this new streaming platform here, so it's a little bit different for me. So bear with me a little bit as I go through it, but just trying to make sure everything is set up right, and I believe it is. And then we will get started. Hope you all are having a good week so far. It was a very pretty day outside. I enjoyed it. I hope you did as well. It was very, very pleasant. It wasn't as hot as it sure seems to have been here lately. Daniel chapter 7 tonight. This is an interesting chapter in that we're kind of transitioning, if you will, from the historical sense of Daniel's life to where we are now in looking at future things to come. So it's very interesting, but it's also lends itself to a problem. And while it's an interesting book, it's certainly a highly contested book, just based on ideas around it and what people are saying, what people are thinking about it. Putting it to ideas such as premillennialism, millennialism as a whole. And a lot of it comes from this book, and a lot of it ties back into the book of Revelation, of course. It's part of all of it. But we're going to see that as we get into this, and there's a lot to cover, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. I know we got a few with us already, but I want to go ahead and get started just because there's a lot of information to go through. Daniel chapter 7. So we ended Daniel chapter 6 with probably one of the most well-known chapters, especially related to the book of Daniel, and that is Daniel in the lion's den. And what we see is Darius honors God towards the end of chapter 6. What you're going to notice, and I'm going to go ahead and read verse 1, you're going to notice a change. So Daniel chapter 7, verse 1 says, "In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head while on his bed. Then he wrote down the dream, telling the main facts." So a couple of things there. One, he's telling the main facts. He's not telling every single detail. And instead, he's just telling some of the main facts. But now, you may already be scratching your head, right? So you're like, well, hang on. Last chapter was about Darius, who, of course, is with the Medes and the Persians. But now we're talking about Belshazzar. So it's kind of a confusing thing. Well, you've got to understand, too, that the book of Daniel is not in chronological order. If it was in chronological order, Daniel chapter 7 would follow Daniel chapter 4, because this is beginning in the first year of Belshazzar's reign. This is all sometime around 553 BC. Then if you remember in chapter 5 that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, that's the end of Belshazzar's reign. In fact, that's the end of Belshazzar's life. He's going to be killed by the Medes and the Persians. But it's important to remember when you get into Daniel chapter 7, and I'm gonna highlight a lot of this as we go through it, because there's a lot of information here, and as I've mentioned already, a lot of information quite commonly taken out of context when it comes to apocalyptic writing, which Daniel, of course, falls into that category. But it's important to remember that this is not some run-of-the-mill dream. This is not just some hallucination. This is a vision. This is a vision to him by God. And what we're going to see is a lot of parallels made between Daniel chapter 7 and Revelation 13 specifically. You'll hear me mention Revelation 13 quite a few times. But Daniel chapter 7 verse 2 says, "Daniel spoke, saying, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea." Now, if you read commentaries and stuff on this, and you can pick your poison on commentary. The greatest commentary for the Bible is the Bible. You don't really need more than this. This is what you need. And if you read commentary, as I said, you're kind of picking your poison. It's good information, but it's words of men, right? And so when you read this and you read verse 2 and it talks about, "Behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea." Well, a lot of people say, well, the great sea, which is highly contested amongst commentators, well, this must mean the Mediterranean. This must mean a literal sea. And the problem is, as soon as you start trying to put that word literal in anything to do with apocalyptic writing, you could almost say it is probably going to be wrong, because you're trying to make something apocalyptic that's not meant to be taken literal. It's meant to be, kind of pointing to something else, making you think about it. You're kind of having to look at what it means, and you're trying to make it literal. Well, when you read through the book of Revelation, you read through much of the New Testament, this great sea is not in reference to the Mediterranean Sea. Now, we have verses that would support the fact that the Mediterranean was a great sea. So their logic in saying that's not just, dumbfounded logic. It's based on some scripture, but they're trying to take it out of context on this verse right here. Instead, what they're doing in chapter 2 is not realizing that the great sea means this great population upon the earth. It's not talking about a literal sea, but when it says we're stirring up the great sea, this is stirring up the population of the earth. And what it was, there was a great wind that blew from heaven. It blew in all directions from the four corners, and it stirred up the people. And we're going to see what's going to come out of this stirring of the people. Because then you get down to verse 3, and 4 beasts came up from the sea, each different from the other. 4 beasts came up from the sea, each different from the other. Now, again, many are trying to make these literal beasts. These are, actual creatures that lived. You can go online and find images of what they think they look like. And as we'll see on the 4th beast, there's not a lot of imagery to it. So they're really kind of grasping for straws on some of that. But again, they're trying to make a figurative language literal. And so you got to keep that in mind. And 4 great beasts came up from the sea, each different from one another. So what you're going to see in Daniel chapter 7 is a lot of parallels, not only to the book of Revelation, but back to Daniel chapter 2. And it's a fascinating parallel between the two, because Daniel chapter 2, of course, is Nebuchadnezzar's dream that Daniel, while he was still a young man, told him the interpretation of what it meant. And it really is a fascinating account just to read through and study. But it talks about the 4 beasts here in this dream. Well, how many nations or kingdoms were represented on the image that Nebuchadnezzar saw in his dream? And if you were with us on the Daniel chapter 2 study, or if you've studied the book of Daniel yourself, then you know that was 4 nations were represented. Babylon, the Medes, the Persians, the Grecians, and the Romans. Well, now we see 4 beasts coming up from the sea. And as they're coming out of this sea, the population of people, great sea is talked here, or churned, or talked about here, I should say, are churned by this wind of heaven. And if you notice, it says they each different from one another, which means they came out sequentially. They didn't come out all 4 at one time. The first came out, the second came out, the third came, and so on, right? So the 4 beasts come from the sea, and they're coming out sequentially. And history verifies this point for us of all of these great powers, that one was defeated and conquered by the next, and they just kept coming one after the other. And so history supports this verse right here. Now, verse 4, we're going to get into what these beasts were like, what they are described as figuratively here in this vision of Daniel, and what they actually reflect in the vision, because we're going to go on further, and it's going to tell us more about what it is. But as I've mentioned already, the Bible is the greatest commentary you have to understand this. And so when we look at some of this imagery, well, this imagery is supported in other places throughout the Bible. And we can see that, and we can know what it's talking about. So verse 4 talks about the first beast. The first was like a lion. It had eagle's wings. I watched till its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the earth and made to stand on 2 feet like a man. And a man's heart was given to it. So as I've mentioned already, we're going to see parallels between Daniel chapter 7 and Daniel chapter 2. The image of Nebuchadnezzar versus the dream of Daniel, both of which were dreams and visions, both of which revelations from God. Now, this image, the first beast that is described for us, is a lion with eagle's wings. Now, a lion represented as this powerful beast, this incredibly powerful thing. Well, from the imagery of Daniel chapter 2, well, we know what was going to be the most powerful beast, the same one that had the golden head that represented Babylon. Babylon, that's what the first beast represents. Not only that, the Bible mentions Babylon using imagery of a lion and of an eagle. You can turn to Ezekiel 17, verse 3, and it talks about eagles. Habakkuk 1:8 does the same thing. But the important part here in verse 4, other than telling us who this first beast is, the important part for me is how verse 4 ends. How verse 4 ends. Now, verse 4 says, I watched until the wings were plucked off, stood on 2 feet, and had the heart of a man. So now, if you remember our study on Daniel chapter 4, there's a lot of parallels back. That's kind of the fascinating part of the story, is you read part of it, and then you have to go back to what we've covered. And so it really kind of tying it in for us, again, with chapter 2 and chapter 4, because as I said, 7 should really chronologically follow chapter 4. But what happened in Daniel chapter 4 that would be relative here? Well, do you remember the fall of Nebuchadnezzar? And really, I say fall, temporary fall of Nebuchadnezzar, because he had 7 years where essentially he lost his mind. He was made to roam as a beast. He was without clothes. He had hair on him. He was eating grass. And if you remember in that study, the reasoning is because he was prideful. It was his pride. He was warned about all of these things, and it was still his pride. Look at this great kingdom I have built for myself. And next thing you know, you're eating grass for 7 years in the field. But at the end of that 7 years, Nebuchadnezzar regains his mind. He worships God, and he has a change. But at this point, Babylon has already reached its summit. It's reached its apex. And now Babylon is already on the decline. Nebuchadnezzar was represented as the golden head. He's the guy. When he says it, it's there. We saw that last week with King Darius. If he made a decree, even the king couldn't change it. The king couldn't even do it. So instead, this was the powerful nation of Babylon. And now they're on the decrease. That's the first beast that we see. Verse 5 says, and suddenly another beast, a second, like a bear. It was raised up on one side and had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And they said thus to it, arise, devour much flesh. The imagery in this figurative language is very impressive. I certainly enjoy reading through it and studying it. But verse 5 talks about our second beast. When you go back to Nebuchadnezzar's dream, of course, Babylon was the first beast, the first image we see, the golden head in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. The first beast here, of course, the lion with eagle's wings. But now after the lion, sequentially next, we have the second beast coming out of the great sea, which is the population of men. This, of course, is the Medes and the Persians. And the bear here mentioned is for these Persians, which, of course, in Nebuchadnezzar's dream was the chest of silver. These parallel accounts here, same thing. But I want you to notice the way it's phrased, that one side was elevated higher than the other. It was raised up on one side, and then it had 3 ribs in its mouth, which we'll get to in a minute. But why in the world would a bear representing the Medes and the Persians be raised up on one side? Now, that's kind of sounds confusing. Sounds like, what does it mean? It was standing up. What does it mean that it was up on one side? Well, history plays this out for us, and we know that the Medes and the Persians were, of course, a combined power. It was 2 nations combined, but the Persians were the more powerful nation, and that plays out in history. We know that. So when we see that this bear, which represents the Medes and the Persians, one side was elevated above the other side, well, that was the Persians. The Persians were elevated more than the Medes were, and we're going to see that. But we can see the viciousness of this bear, and it's got these ribs in its mouth. And again, with figurative language, it draws you in. You're right. You're like, well, what in the world does that mean? Why does this bear have ribs in his mouth? And that would be a good question. It says, arise and devour much flesh. So the three ribs, and again, it's figurative language, right? So pick your poison on commentaries. They're going to tell you different things. This is an area where majority agree on, and it really makes sense when you look at it from the historical sense. But that these three ribs in his mouth represent these three nations that the Medes conquered, that really established their territory, really established their nations. You had Babylon to the west, Lydia to the north, and Egypt to the south. These three nations were conquered by the Medes and Persians. These three nations really set off their land and all that. So it's kind of clear and understanding as to what the three ribs meant, what they represented. But the important part to remember is not the number of ribs. And that's a lot of the issue with people trying to interpret figurative language. Say, I want to understand every single detail. I want to know exactly what it means. Well, the reality is there's some stuff we don't know what it means. We don't fully, we can make educated guesses. We can read the Bible and believe we understand what it talks about, but there's some things we're not given enough information on because it's not really the important part. What we see is the rise of this nation. And we're told about these ribs, and we can make the conclusion based on other information in the Bible and the lands they conquered. But that's not the important part of it. So I want to encourage you with that and really try to get that point across that, stop trying to beat down every little part of it. And let's just get the whole of what this is trying to tell us. Because chapter 7, and I had Melissa read it earlier, and she was just kind of shaking her head at me. This can come across as a very confusing chapter. And people will tweak it and twist it out of its context, and they try to make it fit some preconceived notion, which it does not, when really it's not that complicated. Matter of fact, she just kind of threw out a guess as to what the total was trying to get at, and she nailed it. Not even trying to, I don't believe. But it's not really that complicated to figure out, and we're going to get to more of that here in just a moment. Verse 6 says, after this I looked, and there was another. Now we're on our third beast. There was another like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. Dominion was given to it. Now the leopard signifies, this third beast signifies the nation of Greece. Now the Grecian nation in Nebuchadnezzar's dream was the belly and the thighs of brass. The belly of brass. But notice that this talks about a leopard, a very fast and a very ferocious animal. Then add to it also 4 wings of a bird. You say, well, what in the world does that mean? Why would the Grecian Empire, this third beast, have 4 wings as if it was a flying animal? What does this mean? Well, the reality is that this is talking about a historical event. We can read about it and know. Greece was under the leadership at this point of a young man you've likely heard of before. His name is Alexander the Great. Now, details about Alexander the Great, of course, you've likely studied and heard of his name, but he moved at a lightning pace throughout the known world. He conquered in a short period of time, remembering that he came into power roughly 20, 21 years old. Within 12 years, he had conquered the known world at that time. And so we see this leopard, this fast, ferocious animal with 4 wings, and it's representing this Grecian empire. And in fact, no other nation has been able to conquer as much, as fast as Alexander did with the Grecian Empire. But Alexander the Great died at the age of 33. You look at some say between 32 and 33. And it's kind of speculative as to what he died from, but he died at a young age. And what happened then was his empire was divided. We see at the end of verse 6, the beast also had 4 heads, and dominion, meaning power and authority, was given to these 4 heads. Well, once Alexander the Great died and he passed away, his nation was divided amongst his 4 generals. So they are the 4 beasts that had dominion over this land. Then we get to verse 7, where we're talking about the 4th beast. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong, It had huge iron teeth. It was devouring, breaking into pieces, and trampling the residue with its feet. It was different from all the other beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. It had 10 horns. So now we get to the fourth beast, and we go back to the image of Nebuchadnezzar. Well, the fourth beast with the iron legs was Rome, the Roman Empire, just as we see here with iron in the iron teeth of this animal, of this beast. Now, that we're told this beast is ferocious, is exceedingly strong, it's terrible, it's dreadful. And we're not really given the same imagery about this one because we're told it's just so bad. We don't have the same imagery that we got from the others. But we know this represents Rome. And then we see the 10 horns on this. We're going to get into that more here in the next couple of verses. But the 10 horns represent 10 kings or 10 emperors of Rome. Now, again, you go into commentators, and what you're going to find is just about every one are going to associate this with 10 different kings, 10 different horns. And later on in the chapter, it's going to elaborate on this point that we do know this does, in fact, represent 10 kings, but it lends itself to not be the important part as to whom it is, but as to what they are. They are these 10 emperors of kings of Rome. Now, verse 8 is where we start getting into a lot of the contentious part. Verse 8, so 7, we've got Rome as the fourth beast. We've got this beast with 10 horns, these 10 kings. And like I said, we could speculate and throw out names. Nero, Domitian, we could go through all of these names of what it likely represented, but it's not really that important. We understand whom it is, and that's the important part. But verse 8 tells us, and I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little one, coming up amongst them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out by the roots. And there in this horn were eyes like the eyes of man, and a mouth speaking pompous words. Now, this little horn is very significant. Now, there are a lot of people that will take this verse and say, well, this represents the Antichrist. And I find it hard to make that fit the context here. And I'm going to get to that in a moment, why I say that. But there are a lot of people that are going to take this verse and the next couple of verses and say this represents the Antichrist, this represents the end days, this represents the final judgment scene. And I can't support that. And I can't support that based on what the Bible says in this very chapter about it. And so I'm going to get to that. But there are some that will look at this little horn and say, well, this is the Antichrist. Well, we know this little horn, while we don't know whom the little horn represents, we know they're coming from the Roman Empire. It's on the fourth beast. It's the Roman beast represented as to whom this horn is coming up on. So we know it's the Roman Empire. I've heard some say they think this is Vespasian, and it could be Vespasian fits this little horn very well. Roman leader. He's called back from Jerusalem back to Rome because of problems, chaos. And as he does, he uproots and removes 3 leaders at that time. And then as he gets all this chaos situated, he's going to reign and take over for about 15 years. Others will say it's Domitian, which is very believable. I would tend to follow along with that and say it likely is Domitian, because Domitian we see represented as this great beast in the book of Revelation. Again, trying to take it out of its context and make it fit things it doesn't. But you look at Revelation, you look at relevance to the 7 churches of Asia, we see Domitian there. It's not some future power or future presence that they want, that people, millennialists especially, that they want to make this out to be. That's not what's represented. The part here is clear that the horn is from Rome, and that this beast is representing the Roman Empire. That's what we have. That's what we understand. The rest would just be conjecture. It's us speaking on behalf of it and adding based on preconceived notions, and that happens a lot in this chapter. But let's continue on. And a lot of this, and the reason why I can't support some of what some people want to say and make out of this is going to play out here in the next couple of verses. Verse number 9 says, "And I watched till thrones were put in place, and the Ancient of Days was seated. His garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was a fiery flame, its wheels a burning fire. Now, the Ancient of Days is represented here, of course, as the Almighty, and we see him here as pure, and he's full of wisdom. And that's how we like to view God. That's how we like to view Jesus. But you've got to look at the second part of it too. We're very quick to forget this part. His throne was a fiery flame, and his wheels a burning fire. He's pure and he's full of wisdom, but he's angry and he's full of wrath at the same time. And we're going to see this. Verse 10 says, a fiery stream issued and came forth from before him. 1,000 thousands ministered to him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated and the books were opened. And the books were opened. So a lot of people would now say, this is the judgment scene. This is the final judgment scene right here. This is it. This is it. But who are the 10,000s, the thousands and thousands being referenced here? Well, they're like the angelic host there in heaven. It says the judgment was set. That's what we get from this. The court was seated. The judgment is set. So this must be the final judgment. Well, this is kind of setting the scene for us as to what's going to take place in Revelation 20 when we are getting to the final judgment scene. But you cannot make that fit Daniel chapter 7, and I'm about to show you why. You see, what happens after the final judgment scene? When the trumpet sounds, the seventh trumpet sounds, and Jesus comes back in the clouds, we meet him, we go before God, the book of life is there, is open. What happens in that moment? What happens to time in that moment when the final judgment scene comes? Time is over. Time is no more. Time is done. Time as we know it, represented in this physical life, is over. Because now we're on to eternal. But what happens here? Because again, people are trying to make this fit the final judgment scene. But what happens here? We'll notice in the next verse, in verse 11, time's not over. People are still going to live. People are still going to have more time. See, this is not the final judgment scene as people try to make it. This is the judgment of these nations. This is the judgment of the Roman nation, which Revelation lends itself to the same point, to the exact same point. If this was the final judgment, the book would stop right there because time as we know it stops. But it doesn't here. We have verse 11 and it continues on. So verses 11 says, I watched then because of the sound of the pompous words which the horn was speaking. I watched till the beast was slain and his body destroyed and given to the burning flame. So what happens to this beast? Well, whom does the beast represent? Well, it represents Rome, the Roman Empire. Well, now we've got the pompous words from this horn speaking. Well, the beast is going to be slain. The great beast, the Roman Empire, is going to be destroyed. So in context, we have Rome and we have the judgment of God, the Ancient of Days, on the nation of Rome. And I watched until the beast was slain and his body destroyed and given to the burning flame. So this beast is in power. We're going to look at the torment of it on the church here in just a moment, and we're going to see God's judgment, not on the world. The final judgment has not come, but God's judgment on the Roman Empire and on these great nations as a whole. So verse 12 says, as for the rest of the beast, they had their dominion taken away. And hear this part, yet their lives were prolonged for a season at a time. Well, now hang on. Are we trying to say this is the final judgment, at which point time ends? And people want to make that claim and say that's what this means, especially the millennialist, premillennialist people. But here we see in verse 12, they were prolonged for a season. It didn't end for them there. So you then can't take verses 9 and 10 and 11, and you can't make these into the final judgment scene. This is the judgment of these empires, the same that we saw in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, because you see these great images, this great image represented by multiple nations. Well, what happened? Well, a stone cut out of the mountain without hands destroyed them. That's what we're seeing right here. This is the judgment on these nations. But they weren't completely destroyed. They still had a season and a time. And there's things that we still have today because of these nations, because of things they contributed to society. From Persia, we have a lot of what we understand from law and order. From Greece, we have a lot of what we know about language and the idea behind our language. The Pax Romana from Rome, and we know this is Christ that would come through in the time of Rome. So we have different aspects of these nations, but the point is the power of these nations is being judged and is going to be destroyed by God. Verse 13 and 14 says, I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. He came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. Then to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom the one which shall not be destroyed. So now you go back to Acts chapter 1, and we still got a good ways to go, so I'm not going to flip over there. I initially had the plans to do that, but we would not get through with the chapter in a timely manner, so I'm not going to do that. But you're likely very familiar with the account. Acts chapter 1, well, what happens in the very beginning of the book of Acts, the historical book on the churches? Well, Jesus is taken away in the clouds. He's lifted up and he's taken away in the clouds. And two angels are there talking to the apostles, and it tells them that Jesus is going to return in the same manner in which you saw him leave. So now to take 13 and 14, this is not the second coming of Jesus. I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man. It doesn't say was coming from heaven. One like the Son of Man, that he came to the Ancient of Days, not from the Ancient of Days. And they brought him near before him. Then to him was given all dominion and the glory. So he didn't come from the Ancient of Days. He went to the Ancient of Days. They brought him near, being the angelic host. And if you remember, after the resurrection, Jesus, of course, appeared for 40 days on the earth, and he was teaching, and then he's going to go away. He's going to go and return to heaven. But he tells his apostles, go and wait for the Comforter. Go and wait for what we, of course, know is the Holy Spirit that's going to fall upon the apostles. But why send them to wait for 10 days? Well, we see here in this verses that we just read, these two verses, of a great celebration. Because Jesus, the Son of Man, is come home. He's come back to the Ancient of Days. John 17, verse 5, and I love this verse, it says, and now, O Father, glorify me together with yourself, with the glory which I had with you before the world was. Glorify me again, Father, to the glory of which I had before time even was. Christ's original glory. So now the King of Kings is coming back to heaven. He's being sent back to the Ancient of Days, and to him it was given. Now think about the celebration that ensued in that moment, and the angelic host. And if you ever wonder why it took 10 days, and we don't have the true answers to why it took 10 days, but I believe wholeheartedly that there was a coronation and a celebration going on. There is the kingdom of heaven in focus, but there's also the earthly manifestation of Christ's kingdom in focus here, which we have on earth right now. This is not a kingdom established at the end of time, but now if you go to the millennialist group, they're going to say that's exactly what it means. This means a kingdom that is established at the end of time. But that's not the context in here. It says, which shall not pass away. His dominion is an everlasting. It's not going to be. It is. So we are in Christ's kingdom now, the earthly manifestation of Christ's kingdom. That, of course, is the church. And I'm going to get to that here in just a little bit more of that here in just a minute. And verse 15 says, I, Daniel, was grieved in my spirit within my body, and the visions of my head troubled me. I would say so, wouldn't you? I mean, just think, what would you do if you saw what Daniel saw in this vision? How do you think you would have responded in this very moment? probably just like Daniel. I was grieved in my spirit. Daniel's just a man, and he's experienced an incredible vision. And how do you think you would have responded? Verse 16 says, I came near to one of those who stood by and asked him the truth of all this being an angelic being. So he told me, and he made known the interpretation of these things. Well, all right, what are the interpretations? Let's see if this helps us to understand some of the context here in regard to these verses. Let's look at the context this angelic host is going to tell us. Verse 17 says, those great beasts which are four kings which arise out of the earth. Well, we've mentioned that already. Nebuchadnezzar saw that in his dream, of which Daniel interpreted Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. So we understand that. It should be surprised. Even that point is contested. Verse 18 says, but the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever and ever, even forever. And I love this verse. I love this verse. These great four powerful nations, but the saints. Well, why but the saints? Because of God. And the Most High shall receive the kingdom. And what we know about the kingdom, what we know about Christianity as a whole, is how would we possess the kingdom? Well, if you go and you ask any of these four nations that are no more, that are certainly not to the power they once had and to whom they once were, if they were going to go and they were going to take this nation, it was going to be by force, it was going to be by the sword, it was going to be, I want this land, this is my land now, you're going to leave, you're going to die. Likely you're going to die anyways. But for Christians, we're not taking this kingdom by force. We're not going to possess this kingdom by force. It's a spiritual kingdom. And the weapons of our warfare are spiritual. They're not carnal. The gospel is our two-edged sword. We don't need the literal sword as those of these nations would fight with. And then Daniel asks this question, then I wish to know the truth about the fourth beast. Because the fourth beast was described differently from the rest. We didn't even get the same level of imagery on the fourth beast, which of course is the Roman Empire. It says that I wish to know the truth about the fourth beast, which was different from all the others, exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth of iron and its nails of bronze, which devoured and broke into pieces and trampled the residue with its feet. And the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn which came up before the three fell, namely that horn which had eyes and a mouth, which spoke pompous words, whose appearance was greater than all his fellows. Man, he wants to know what this means. What in the world does this thing represent? Well, we know it represents Rome. I was watching, and the same horn was making war against the saints and prevailing against them. And notice what verse 22 says. Until the Ancient of Days came, and a judgment was made in favor of the saints, was made in favor of the saints of the Most High, and the time came for the saints to possess the kingdom. Now, I tried to emphasize a couple of statements there that I'm going to get into more as we go. Now, the four of this fourth nation, that is Rome, their war is with Christians. You can read through the book of Revelation, and the persecution faced amongst the churches, the encouragement to the 7 churches of Asia, was because of Roman persecution. And we can see this persecution in the parallel accounts between this and Revelation. Now, Rome persecuted the church until judgment was given to Rome. Now, the millennialists, and I'm not just trying to pick on the premillennialists, but because there's several that hold to this mindset and really trying to make this fit a preconceived notion of something they've likely been taught their whole lives, instead of just reading it for what it is. Rome persecuted the church until the judgment came. And the verse here says, in a passage I emphasized, and the time came. Now, if I'm a millennialist person and I'm saying, well, the time is going to come when the 1,000-year reign is going to be established, this verse really for me needs to read, and this time is going to come. But this verse here reads, and the time came, not will come, which throws a wrench into the futuristic teaching here of millennialists. Time has already came in this verse. The church was being persecuted. The kingdom of Christ, the church here manifested is his earthly kingdom, is being persecuted. The saints are being persecuted by the Romans, and God is going to execute judgment on the city, on the nation of Rome. So where is Rome today? Well, Rome is still there. Are they anything like they were in the first century? Not even close. Where is the church today? See, the church overcame this persecution because the Ancient of Days exercised judgment. We're going to see more of this in the last couple of verses. But we see this. This is not the final judgment scene. This is the judgment on these nations. Verse 23, thus he said, the fourth beast shall be a fourth kingdom on earth, Rome, that's what we've been talking about, which shall be different from all the other kingdoms. And it shall devour the whole earth, trample it and break it in pieces. Now, Rome was different than all the others. Rome, at one point in time, was a republic before they turned into what we, of course, know of the first century Romans and the emperor worship they were trying to enforce and all of that. They were different than the rest at a time. Now, they're, of course, described as more vicious than the others, and we see that. Verse 24, then the 10 horns are 10 kings. There gives us our answer. What do the 10 horns represent? 10 kings. Well, what 10 kings? Well, it didn't matter enough for them to tell us in the verse, so we could speculate and try to come up with what it really meant. But what's important to us and what it does tell us is that it represents 10 kings. Who shall arise from this kingdom? And another shall arise after them. He shall be different from the first ones, and he shall subdue the 3 kings. Now, again, I believe this is Domitian, but you could say, no, this is Vespasian. You could add whatever you want. But what we do know, especially for those saying, well, Antichrist and all these other things tied to the final judgment scene, whereas we don't know if the little horn here means Vespasian, Domitian. We don't know what it means, but we know something very important. The beast came already. The beast came, and it came from Rome. Those 2 details we know. So to say, well, it's the Antichrist and it's coming later. Well, no, hang on. This beast came. Past tense. It's came, not coming. And in verse 25 says, and he shall speak pompous words against the Most High. He shall persecute the saints of the Most High. And he shall intend to change times and law. Then the saints shall be given into his hand for a time and a half time. Now, we see the same mentioning of time in the book of Revelations. This is a figurative sense. Of course, we understand that because this is figurative language in general. Just as, there wasn't a realistic lion with eagle's wings, it was a figurative language. So this is a figurative time sense to represent this intense persecution, just as the first century Christians faced. It's a time with a beginning, but importantly here, and it says time came, it is an ending point as well. Verse 26 says, but the court shall be seated, and they shall take away his dominion to consume and destroy it forever. Rome would never be as strong as it was in that day. It began to decline. It was attacked from the outside. It was filled with corruption on the inside. The church played a part in the downfall of the Christian. The Christian ideas began to destroy Rome from the inside. And it continued to decline until the Roman Empire of the first century fell apart altogether. Now, verse 20 says, then the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people, the saints of the Most High. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominion shall serve and obey him. From the time the Lord's kingdom was established, I've already mentioned, we see the manifestation here today, the church. From the time the Lord's kingdom was established, it has always been with us, and it will always be with us until Christ returns. That's the guarantee we have. Rome fell. It's not what it was in the first century. The Medes, the Persians, Babylon, Greece, none of it. Yet the church is still here. It is an everlasting kingdom. We are in the earthly kingdom of Christ now. We're in the last days. And when we go home with him, we'll be in the heavenly kingdom. And verse 28 wraps up the chapter, and it says, "This is the end of the account. As for me, my thoughts greatly troubled me, and my countenance changed, but I kept the manner in my heart." Now, at the point that Daniel is recounting this vision, you've got to remember that he's a fairly old man now, relatively speaking. He's certainly not as old as he once seemed to me until I got to the age I am now. But when he was brought into Babylon, he was a young man. He was in his teens, early 20s maybe. I mean, he was a young person. Now that he's writing this, if you go back and you look at the lineage of the kings that were there, he's likely in his 60s. He's an old man. He's not a young man at this point. But I want to wrap up with a couple of thoughts, and then I'll be done. I know I went a little longer than I meant to. But I want to wrap up with a couple of thoughts here, and then this will be yours to do what you will with it. If you'd like to study more, I'd be more than happy to do so. If you got any questions, make sure you're putting them on there. I normally include that statement. I didn't. I was a little too excited to get into this today because there's a lot of information. And unfortunately, people like to take this chapter and bend it to fit something that it doesn't. Well, this means the final judgment scene. Well, everything I've been taught about the final judgment scene is wrong, because what I know about the final judgment scene is time is over at that point. Time is done. But if you're telling me this is the final judgment scene, then something is wrong, because time kept going. It wasn't over. It wasn't done. These nations still had time. They didn't have the power, but they still had time. So, how can this fit? They say, well, what do the three ribs mean? Who are the 10 kings? What does the little horn mean? What is this? Well, we know the 4 beasts, and we know that there's going to be a stone cut out that's going to destroy it. We know there's going to be a kingdom that is everlasting. See, we get so wound up on the little details that were not given in a figurative sense, in which time people try to take and make literal to mean a literal kingdom to come, 1,000-year reign on this earth to come, even though it says it has already come. So there's already, conflicting ideas here with this. And it's not really conflicting ideas. It's conflicting ideas for them. There's no conflict in the Bible. It's their misconception on what it's saying. But what is the important part? What is the takeaway from this chapter? What are you going to draw from Daniel chapter 7? What is the important part? Nations are going to rise. Nations are going to fall. We live in a fantastic country. But look at what happens in the polarizing events around election time, in the conflict between Republicans and Democrats, and all of this to do with governments. It's polarizing. It's divisive. It's combative. Nations are going to rise and nations are going to fall. Look at Babylon. Look at Greece. Look at Persia. Look at Rome. Nations are going to rise. Nations are going to fall. But the best news that we can take away from Daniel chapter 7 is Christ's kingdom is everlasting, and his dominion is forever. We don't have to worry about the other things. That's the good news. That's why I wish I could go back and tell Daniel, like, man, don't worry about this. This is the good news. Christ's kingdom is everlasting. His dominion is forever. The 4 powers, they've all been tamed, and the church is still going, and will do so until Christ calls us home. And will do so until Christ calls us home. Well, I think I've about talked. I'm just about hoarse tonight. I didn't mean to go as long as I did, but there's so much information in Daniel chapter 7, and more concerning, I guess I would say, is the misconceptions on Daniel chapter 7 and the need or necessity to make this fit a millennialistic idea, and it doesn't. It's taken out of context to do that. So I hope you all have enjoyed the study tonight. I hope it's been an informative study tonight. I hope that you've been able to take something away from it. Remember, when you read a figurative language as apocalyptic writing is what Daniel is, what Revelation is, stop trying to make it literal. Just read it. Read it. The best commentary for the Bible is the Bible. Just read it and it'll answer itself out. That we're told at the end of the chapter what the 10 horns were, what these nations are. We're told. But we're told the best news, that Christ's kingdom is everlasting. So I hope you all draw the same encouragement from that I do, especially if you watch the news any length of time, because it can be heartbreaking to see what's going on in our society today. But it's not a unique problem, because you can go back and look at these other nations and see. But the good thing for us is Christ's kingdom is everlasting. If you have any questions or any comments on this lesson, please make sure you're getting them on there. I'd be curious to see what you think. I'd be curious to see if you have any questions. If you'd like to study more about Daniel chapter 7, we'll get in chapter 8 next week. Or if you'd like to study more about the parallels between Daniel and Revelation, please let me know. I'd be happy to study with you. If not, hey, I appreciate your time tonight. I know it's a challenging study, and I wish we were able to do this around a table and talk in a very personal setting. I miss getting to see so many of the faces I've been drawn so close to. Hopefully I will soon. I'm very excited what we heard today from Tate Reeves' announcement. So I'm very excited to get to hear what we heard today, that there's plans now for churches to start opening back up. And I'm excited and encouraged for that. But I hope you all have a good rest of your night. I look forward to the Bible study tomorrow night at 7 o'clock on Ephesians. It's been a very good study, I feel. There's a lot of takeaways from that book, just as there are a lot of practical application takeaways from the book of Daniel. So I hope you all have a good rest of your night. I hope you have a good rest of your week if you're not with us tomorrow. And Lord willing, I hope to see you very soon. You all have a good night. Thank you very much, and God bless.